So in the previous presentation, we have this reference to a smart city. Is there such a thing? I mean, to me, this sounds like terminology. Can you explain what a smart city is?
So yeah, I mean, obviously there's a whole movement and hype around smart city, and there's a logic to it, I think, that on one level makes sense. So it's about how cities use tech and their data to just function and operate better. So it's partly an efficiency story, it's a modernization story, and I think there's a lot that's useful in that. The part of it that I think is not useful hype, and unfortunately I think in the framing that our president raised it in Sona, and I think is really not useful as well, is this idea that it's about new, shiny cities that are the opposite of what we have. I think that's not a useful framing. I think we need smarter cities do better with their data and that can be more efficient. But I don't think it's anything to do with those spaces being new or shiny. I think it's
so a smart city is data, not the shininess of buildings.
It's not about that at all. And so this idea that for us to have a smart city would look something like a Dubai or like a Singapore would really miss the point, because we're not Dubai or Singapore. And Singapore looks like Singapore because it's Singapore. Dubai, okay, I don't know what Dubai is doing. But Barcelona, which is also one of those, I guess they're doing that because they're rich. I mean, Barcelona is considered to be a smart city. And again, I would say is a city that's very smart in its own terms and within its context.
But why? What makes it smart?
So I think a human-centric element to it. So I have my big 3 stories about what I think would be smart for us. And the big one, the first one is about an imaginary that's new and that's contextualized. So I think cities that aren't trying to mimic or copycat, but are trying to figure out within their context and within what it is that's in their DNA, how could they thrive? How could they be better? And that needs an imaginary that's contextualized, but that's also open, that isn't just trying to be something else. And I think Barcelona does that, and I think Singapore does that. My second one would be around processes that are inclusive. So I think here we very much take this attitude that inclusion is about an outcome. It's something you get at the end of doing whatever you're doing. So you deliver inclusivity. I think inclusivity of the kinds of things Thireshen is talking about, what's happening at the micro, what's actually going on in your space, the many, not the one, is how you get inclusion. If you're not inclusive in process, you're not going to be inclusive in outcome. We have cities that are doing so much, and in spite of so much hardship, people who are doing so much. How do you enable that, and how do you leverage that to do things that are new or different? I think Barcelona, which is extremely people-centric. Smart City Bristol is another example that I would use that I think is really great. How do you crowdsource? How do you really get people to express through their lives, but also through their voices, what they think is smart. And I think one can do that, and that tends to be excluded from the idea of smart city. My third one is institutions. You can't have smart cities in bureaucratic, old-fashioned institutions that don't actually want to do anything differently, and we're surrounded by those.
Can I add to that? Because I think this definition of smart cities is important. I also like to just frame what a city is. I think that to talk about it holistically, to say that the city region of Johannesburg is a city, I struggle with, because you've got to look at it at a lot more granular level to understand the nuance of different neighborhoods within the city. And I think that I like the scale of the neighborhood because it's tangible, and I think you can identify a better metric for each of those pieces. So if I had to expand...
So we should be talking about neighborhoods rather than cities, or we should be using neighborhoods as our term of reference?
You could use either, but I like to distinguish between a city and a neighborhood. And I think that I could talk with more authority on neighborhoods because it's a scale that I'm familiar with, and then you can apply it to a city. And a city comprises...
So make me a smart neighborhood.
A smart neighborhood for me, for example, is one that has aspects of dynamism, so it's responsive. It's responsive to both risk and opportunity because we're faced with both of them in disproportionate quantities in these neighborhoods, and that if these neighborhoods have got inbuilt intelligence to respond to these things, that makes it smart for me. I think that the point about what Geci is talking about with the imaginary is critical for me because a neighborhood that is able to understand what its key offering is, culturally, socially, is something that should be if you can allow that to take place, that'll be really great. So that's a version of a smart city, and the ability to be responsive. I think that's what I was saying in the second one. That the responsiveness is what makes it smart. Because what Ronak was talking about was an incredibly volatile, shifting set of environmental challenges we're facing. A city that's fast and can respond, it makes it smarter than the one that's become a little bit more dinosaur-like.
Your reference to sort of the glossy and the shiny reminds me of a talk I saw recently by an architect who says, please, no more, not one single glass building. That it may represent something, but it doesn't make it something, which I hear you saying.
Yeah. I think, so cities are exciting to many people for many reasons. And I think maybe the glossy facade and the skyline and some of these ideas we hold when we think about cities that are great, I think is partly what tends to, I would say, occupy the imaginary of many people. I think the more one moves away from that to something more substantial, probably maybe is the call for this. So you don't become a great, and at one stage I think there was a recipe for a great city. So I function at the scale of cities, as you might have realized, and he at the scale of neighborhood. But there used to be a recipe for being a successful city. A successful city was one that had a stadium, that had a convention center, that had a big airport that looks the same like every other big airport. And so it was this kind of, set of things that were titled, how you make place or how you make great cities. I think we're moving away from that to a much more refined, much more contextual understanding. And I really do think that for African cities in particular, if we're going to strive to have the kind of cities that look like cities elsewhere, I think we'll miss the point of what the possibilities for us are. Not to say we couldn't learn from elsewhere. So for example, I think for certain we need to have cities that appreciate that solar is a big asset for us, and anything we can do that uses the resource we've got is great. But if it's also going to be a city that's completely unaffordable to the majority, so yesterday for World Cities Day, we did a walk around Joburg and spoke to many different people who are doing development. One of the stories of Joburg, which I find very strange because I think we're a capitalist society, but in some ways we behave rather uncapitalistic. I'm not a capitalist myself, so I can speak. We're not producing enough affordable housing, and there's a lot of money to be made, and some people are making a lot of money in it, but we're simply not doing that. And there are many other things we're not doing that we could be, ought to be doing in our city. And we can talk about, I'm sure you can all advise, what is it that's happening in our economy and our industries that's not responding to opportunity and need. But that's really one key example that one faces in the inner city. Thireshen can tell you about work he's done, for example, looking at cross-border trading and the scale of that in our inner city. Zeros that compete with Santon zeros, but yet again we've got a system that seems to want to oppose that rather than to understand. So these billions that are flowing through the inner city, how do you see that as part of your GDP? How do you make sense of statistics that are telling us that we are shedding jobs and we're not doing great, but in fact we're creating jobs in the informal sector? And not necessarily bad jobs in all cases. How do we make sense of that? So we seem to have some inability to be in the cities we're in because I think we're trying to run in somebody else's game. Maybe to go back to the Iliad, my fellow countryman's metaphor. I think it's great that he ran so fantastically. But I don't think we're in the space of running in somebody else's marathon. I think we need to be in the space of trying to figure out what sport we're in, and then we could really do well in that.
So incidentally, from the time we've started this morning to now, he's done 40 kilometers. Yeah. I'm not sure. What I hear you guys saying to me is that smart cities are dynamic, they're intelligent, and they have that dynamism comes from their ability to respond to that intelligence, to those insights. But I'm going to put these words in your mouths. I hear you describing them as having soul. And perhaps the soul exists more at the neighborhood level than at the city level. Would that be fair?
I think absolutely. And I think maybe the other thing I'd add is they use the resources they have. And I think the soul comes out of those resources. Okay. Whether it's natural resources or human resources, you don't focus on the resources you don't have. You focus on what's there.
Yeah, and I think to help make the point, many of us are familiar with Rosebank, what's going on. That's lots of glass fancy
Yeah.
glass and light. And so architects would look at the building, and the building performs incredibly well environmentally. It does all the things that it should be doing. In its isolation, it does really well. But what it's done for the neighborhood is highly problematic. You'll see that a lot of the buildings put up don't make good street life. It doesn't look at making more inclusive what the neighborhood is about, where participation lies. You'll see that the capital flows are quite specific about where that goes to, and it's a missed opportunity. And if I think about what Rosebank was a few, like 15, 20 years ago, it's very different to what it is right now. So I think that for me is a paradox where it looks smart but behaves quite toddler-like.